So here we are at the Royal Academy of Music, and separating Professor Timothy Jones and me, Jonathan Freeman-Attwood, is Mozart's table from Vienna, and quite appropriately we're here to talk about Mozart. And in particular, this wonderful project that Rachel Podger and Christopher Glynn have been undertaking, a recording, no less. And the person who's at the heart of this, other than Mozart, is Tim Jones. And my first question is to Tim, is here we have a recording that's been made of 3 allegros that Mozart left unfinished and have been completed, and a fantasy as well, we should add. But Tim, first of all, what is the point of completing Mozart also?
Well, some of these little beginnings of movements are magnificent music, and perhaps they're not very well known. I mean, the B-flat sonata was completed by Abbe Stadler at the beginning of the 19th century, and so that's at least been performable for almost 200 years now. But the others are known to musicologists, not known especially well to players, I think, and they deserve to be known. So I suppose it's a way of getting the music out there. The other thing that I've done with this, which isn't about circulating the scores themselves, but it's thinking about what the pieces might have become in Mozart's hands. And I don't know how he'd have finished them, but I've got some idea of the sort of routes that he might have taken. And so what I've tried to do in these completions is to just explore some of the potential that the openings of these movements have, and to realise them in different ways, partly for my own amusement, partly to comment on Mozart's style, I suppose. But then, thirdly, that if people would like to play them, then hurrah.
Yeah, and not sparing your blushes, but you have been immersing yourself in the music of Mozart all your life, really. And therefore, when you're putting together something like this, it isn't that you're saying this is what Mozart would have done, but you're saying, here I am as a person living in the 21st century, commenting on a set of sort of, what can you say, sort of stages of Mozart, really.
Yes, I mean, I'm looking at the way in which I perceive his style to have been changing and his working methods to have been changing almost on a month-by-month basis towards the end of his life. And I think lots of scholars have done work on how we can date some of these fragments, and we've got a much better idea of when Mozart himself wrote them. And that in itself gives me a very new perspective to work on that some others who might have looked at these, let's say, 40 years ago, let alone 140 years ago, wouldn't really have had. So, I'm standing on the shoulders of giants like Alan Tyson, who did all that philological work on the paper that Mozart uses to compose, and some German musicologists as well who've done a lot about Mozart's handwriting, about the inks that he used, and also about his working methods, how he actually went about putting a score together. So, I've got all that I've been able to think about, and my own immersion in Mozart has really been to do with his style for a long, long time. And so what I've tried to do is to put all that technical knowledge of the way he went about composing when he was writing these, and thinking about, what were his composition interests at that time in his life. And I really am thinking, almost at times on a week-by-week basis.
I was going to say, sometimes you know exactly when he started something.
Yes.
And there are how many of these sort of fragments, torsos, whatever?
Well, there are over 100 of them that date from the last 10 years of his life. And I think that there's a difference between, some of them are very, very short, and they disappear after a few bars. If that's the case, then one might think, okay, he's abandoned that, and he really thought it was problematic, he moves on. The other thing one can tell with those manuscripts that he abandons is that he starts doodling on them. He'll either start sketching for other pieces, or he'll start doing little mathematical sums down the side of the page, or he'll start writing nonsense poetry in a few instances. So you can see, okay, the work was finished and it's just scrap paper. But a lot of these, they're like every other single manuscript he wrote. That they even when the music comes to a stop, and often it comes to the stop at the end of a page. So it may be that we're missing some other music that may have been attached to some of these fragments. But even when it comes to the stop in the middle of the page, there's no sense that he's using the paper for anything else. So I think it's just there waiting to be finished.
Now, you've pretty well been working on all of these torsos, haven't you? And but the violin sonatas in particular are quite interesting, aren't they? Because he wrote violin sonatas throughout his life. Tell us about these three pieces, because I should say at this stage that one of the things about trying to create living music for living musicians, and the fact that although you're a Mozart scholar, you're also a pianist, you're also somebody who thinks as a musician, not just as a scholar, which is why you have such fun working with this, and probably why, in terms of your engagement and your sense of invention, you go for sometimes as many as 4 completions. I think in a couple of cases you go even further. But in the case of this, I think there are on each of these sonatas 4 completions, of which you've chosen to...
Yes, exactly. So for the A major there are 4, which I've chosen 2, and for the B flat I think there were 5, and again I've chosen 2 from those 5 for this recording. Now, I mean, the reason why I did that is that in some of these fragments, where Mozart stops, really is at a pivot point where one imagines it could have gone in any one of many directions. But I think that you're right that I'm thinking back to the experience of playing these pieces, not only as a pianist, but you'll remember when I was young, I was a terrible violinist as well. And
I didn't want to say that.
No, but I was a terrible violinist, and I used to hack through them on the violin quite a lot as well when I was a teenager. But the one thing I realised, even though technically I must have played so out of tune, it sounded awful, but the one thing I was aware of there was how much one had to be sensitive to the interplay of the 2 instruments. And getting that from both angles is something that I found I couldn't ignore to do these completions. And I also want to say that of course, as well as playing these things myself years ago, I've got lots of different performances I've heard over the years in my head. But in particular, the recordings that Rachel Podger made of the completed sonatas is something which, certainly blew me away when they appeared. And I certainly had Rachel's immensely engaging way with this music in my head when I was making these completions. So it's absolutely wonderful to hear them realised in her hands.
Do you think, I'm always fascinated because I'm in an office next door to you, so I often have little sheets of paper sent under the door just for your view on, or rather to asking for my view on where you're going in a particular direction. And I'm not suggesting that I have ever given you any advice that's of any use to you, but it's always, one of the things that is always fascinating to me is the extent sometimes of where you're trying to kind of navigate a Mozartian thought process on the basis of your research, on the basis of where he was in his head at that time, sometimes that very week, with what he's been composing around then. And I always feel that there are some times when you're going off and you're saying, well, this is what I kind of want to do anyway.
Yes. Well, these things take on a life of their own, and the momentum.
And that is when you get to the area where you're not talking so much about a sort of historical sense of authenticity or anything. Not that any of that could be the case anyway, because Mozart's been dead for a long time.
Yeah.
But there's a point sometimes where you say, that is Jones imagining what Mozart might have done had he had a bit of me in him.
Well, because we've got Madame Tussauds distant and I think that what I didn't want to produce was sort of whacked works of these things. And so, I think you're right, that sometimes, as I said, the momentum takes on its own direction, and then I've got to think, oh God, how do I sort of ride this in a Mozartian way, or as Mozartian as I can make it sound to my own ears? But sometimes it comes out sounding, well, I don't know, not especially like him, even if I've applied his techniques to the material. I wouldn't see every one of these completions as being successful in this way, as having sort of made a statement. And I'm not sure I see any of them as statements in a way. I see them as experiments, really.
Let's just remind people that this disc has 3 sonata allegros, of which each has 2 different completions by Tim. and then one completion of the Fantasy in C minor. And one of the questions is, how do you create a satisfying 58, 60-minute recording with really the music, in one sense, working, repeating itself? I mean, some of it repeats itself, but how different are these completions in terms of the way the players and the listeners can engage with the very strong initial Mozartian material?
Well, should we start with the G major sonata,
Yeah.
which is the very last of the fragments, probably from 1789, so much later than any of the completed violin sonatas. And it's an unusual fragment in that it's fairly short, it's about 34 bars, but it's very skeletal. So even in the bars where Mozart has jotted down ideas, I think the texture's only complete really for the first 10 or so bars, and after that he just puts down the main idea and a few hints of subsidiary sort of accompanying things. But there is so much material in those 35 bars. Thinking about what he was up to in 1789, there are quite a few pieces that he started in 1789 that he finished in the last year of his life. The last piano concerto is the best known example, I guess. And in all these pieces, the thing to wrestle, that I had to wrestle with, was that his style is changing quite rapidly over these 2 years. Then on the one hand, it's becoming more transparent in some ways. He's not writing music that's self-consciously difficult like the quartets he dedicated to Haydn in 1785, for example. But the technique that enables him to be so transparent just sort of goes off the scale in what he's able to do. So I was trying to balance this idea of, okay, can I do one completion that just goes all out for transparency, and so where the idea of moment by moment continuity in the music that Mozart's dad called il filo, and was always encouraging his son to really put at the forefront of his music. That's really what drives the first completion of this. So I hope that there's sort of light in the textures, and that there's nothing that's too shocking that happens, but it's still engaging in the way that Mozart played music is. But then for the second one, I thought, right, I'm going to go all out for this idea of the more complex harmonic language that Mozart's developing.
Slightly knottier.
Much knottier. Something that's actually rather harder to follow on a moment-by-moment basis at times. Some with types of music that we always get information overload, which is something that Mozart can be prone to at times towards the end of his life. And particularly in the development section of this second completion, the idea that it would go through processes twice, once in this knotty way that's hard to follow, and then the same thing in a much more conventional way, which is easier to follow, so that the knotty way sort of poses a problem, then you give a solution to it immediately, and the solution drives towards the rest of the completion of the movement. So I think the way that they turned out sounded completely different to mine.
Yes, and they do when you listen to them, and they're very complementary, I think.
So this is just a little bit from the G major completion. So it starts out with the piano, which has the tune, and then I get the tune, which goes like this. And so that goes on for a little bit, and then the piano takes over and has some kind of more chromatic kind of bits, doesn't it? And the violin comments, and then the fragment finishes. And so Tim Jones picks up this chromatic line and gives me this to play. And then I accompany the piano, it carries on. But you know, you kind of look at that and you think, gosh, that's very chromatic. And there are bits in Mozart where I sometimes think, gosh, that's really, really chronically. Actually, in some of the sonatas, I can think of certain moments. And I just love the way that Tim has not shied away from kind of pushing that material. Because it does, it's quirky, but it's so playful. And
so operatic as well, isn't it? It feels very operatic, that bit.
Yeah, it really does. It's kind of it's showy. Yeah, it's really, really fun.
And it's almost as if it's what Mozart might have done if he'd have had the right audience for it. Because he was a working musician, he had to please as well as, so to do anything too naughty, wouldn't have always worked. And I think he sometimes had that more sophisticated audience and sometimes he didn't. So maybe it's just, I feel sometimes that Tim's exploring what he might have done if he had a bit more freedom. I don't know.
Yeah, good point. Absolutely. And who he might have wanted to please in the audience.
Yeah, who he was showing off to that day.
Last sonata allegro is in the A major. Where does that fit in the equation?
We don't know really. That's the trouble with this one, is that it could have been written in 1784 as a sort of first go at a concert for a big public concert he was giving with an Italian violinist called Regina Strinasacchi. But the paper that he writes it on, this is where Alan Tice's work comes in. He used that paper in 1784, but he used it again in 1787, which is where the A major sonata, the wonderful sonata K526 dates from the summer there. So I don't really know whether he started this in 1784 or in 1787. The handwriting doesn't tell us anything, the inks don't tell us anything about that. So with the two completions that we've got on this disc, the second of them, which is number 4, I think, I imagine that, this is something he'd written for a public concert in Vienna. It was quite unusual for violin sonatas to be in public concerts anyway, therefore it needed to be outgoing, quite big gestures, nothing too subtle in the interplay. But then the other version we put in, I sort of did a thought experiment, and of course he didn't write that many violin sonatas in the last 6 years of his life. They all tend to be about 2 years apart. So I thought, okay, let's assume that he'd started this A major sonata at some point between 84 and 87, and then got back to it in 89 or in 1790. I mean, I know he didn't, but let's say he had encountered this fragment and thought, I could work with it and get a bit of money from publication. What might it have looked like in the context of what he was writing next? The late string quartets, the clarinet quintet, and so on. And so I've tried again to make that just a little bit more subtle harmonically, a bit more interplay between the instruments, that perhaps a bit more for connoisseurs than the first one.
This is another one. This is the A major fragment completion. So this is also a case of Mozart writing 34 bars and then Tim writing the rest. And so this movement has 190 something, 6 or so bars. And I just thought I'd just play you a bit of the Mozart and how it kind of breaks off. So this piece goes like this. It kind of starts with chords. And the piano has this tune. And then it goes through that, and then there's a little progression, and then there's this tune. So that's me accompanying the piano. This is still Mozart, and then there's another little progression. So that's the end of the Mozart. Of course, you can tell, mine is a little kind of accompanying motive, and actually, Chris has got all the busy, playful scales up and down and all sorts of things going on. But anyway, so he didn't get any further. So this is what Tim does after Mozart stops. So basically, he's just invented this tune. And this really sounds like Mozart to me.
yeah, I really admire that, because the way that flows onto the Mozart is so natural and consequential, and the sort of upholstery of it is just amazing, isn't it? I mean, you just don't feel the joints at all. I mean,
Yes, so true. It's, yeah, really the case.
but I don't think we ever. I don't think we ever felt the joints, did we? You know, there's those moments where we can see on the page that Mozart finishes it,
No,
and Jones
and
begins.
absolutely, yeah. The first time when I played them through, I wasn't really looking at where the fragment stopped. I was just kind of getting to the piece as a whole, and really, I wasn't thinking, that must be Mozart, that must be Jones. But I did actually catch myself then checking afterwards, after having done it a few times, thinking, is that actually Mozart?
Yeah, and I checked a couple of bits, and I thought, Mozart would never have done that. And of course, when I checked, that was the bit that was Mozart.
That was Mozart. Yeah. It's so interesting.
Because the whole point is because Mozart never does what you expect anyway. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah, he never repeats himself, and he never
so unpredictable.
Does the obvious.
Yeah.
Tim, last question. If people want to get hold of your completions to analyse, to enjoy, to perform, how do they get hold of them?
Well, they come to the Royal Academy of Music website, and if they go on the research pages, all the scores are available there. So if you put in Mozart Fragments Project and Royal Academy of Music, that should get you to the right page on our website.
Fantastic. As Tim said, Rachel with Gary Cooper have recorded, of course, the complete music for piano and violin and piano. And so this is a wonderful sort of appendix to that project with Chris Glynn on this occasion. And I hope you enjoy it very much. Thank you.